Feeling peckish? Then come on down to Limbus Company Cookery. Our oven is hot and ready to burn you a chicken to the degree of your request. Whether you like your chicken rare, well done, burnt, or reduced to its base particles, we've got you covered for any palate you can come up with. Just don't ask us about the cooking process. Burn is probably the least complicated status effect in all of Limbus Company. At the end of every turn, it deals damage equal to the potency, and then the count is reduced by 1. And that's it! Nothing more complicated to mention here. While a bit underwhelming, Burn ends up being useful because passive typeless damage tends to be very useful against more difficult boss enemies who might have high resistances. It's also useful to note that burn damage can stagger units, something that isn't shared with a lot of passive forms of damage like with Bleed. That being said, without building a team around it, it tends to be irrelevant in most fights, but that's why I'm making this video, so you can build a team where it's easier to stack and keep burn stacked. The most valuable Sin Affinities for a burn team are Lust, Sloth, Pride, and Envy. I'm not including Wrath here because literally every burn ID has at least one Wrath skill, and the only ID who can inflict burn that doesn't is Ring Yi-Sang anyways. Lust and Pride are both fairly common on IDs that either inflict burn or ones that work well alongside burn teams, so you likely won't struggle for either of those. Sloth and Envy are the two big Sin Affinities that you're probably going to struggle with, since Envy is fairly uncommon on burn IDs, and Sloth is literally only found on Liu Merceau's skill 2 and Liu Gregor's skill 3, neither of which are very good skills. You need these affinities because burn E.G.O tend to need a lot of Wrath, Lust, and Pride, but then will randomly require 1 to 2 Sloth or Envy. And here's the thing, burn relies very heavily on its E.G.O to perform well in most situations. Mostly because while the IDs themselves tend to be slightly below the curve in terms of clash strength, their E.G.O rolls absurdly high or improves their damage by a good margin. Or both, thanks 4th match Flame Ryoshu. And that's actually a great place to start here. Ryoshu's 4th match Flame is, in many ways, the backbone of this team. It is a 3-target AoE that rolls absurdly high, gains power if the opponent has burn, can deal as much as double damage if the enemy has at least 20 burn, and gives 2 attack power up to Ryoshu next turn for every kill it secures. Not only that, but the passive makes every 4th skill that Ryoshu uses gain +4 final power, and also inflict 4 burn with every hit, which is just insane, if we're being honest. And while it isn't exactly practical to always do it, the overclocked version of the E.G.O is easy to fuel, and gives even more attack power up for a kill, but also gives you attack power up in addition to burn for every failed kill. And yes, this activates for every enemy who is hit, meaning you can get 9 final power up from a single use. It will cost you 30 HP at the end of the turn in the form of burn damage, so be sure not to do this against bosses who inflict a lot of burn count. Ryoshu's Forest for the Flames is also important as it can inflict Fragile next turn, and rolls surprisingly high for a base E.G.O. It's also incredibly cheap, and I'd be surprised if there is ever a turn when you're unable to use it for some reason. But those are the only 2 E.G.O that fit into this team which don't require at least 1 Sloth or Envy. Nevertheless, there are a few other E.G.O which are very important for the team. The first of these is Ishmael's Ardor Blossom Star, one of the most powerful damaging E.G.O in the entire game since its launch. It's on the more expensive side, but aside from the 1 Envy needed, you aren't likely to run low on the Wrath and Lust resources it requires. This attack inflicts a ton of burn provided it hits heads, and also increases the enemy's stagger threshold by 40% of the damage dealt, which, for a skill that deals 250 damage on average, is comparable to bursting Tremor while running a dedicated Tremor team. Plus, the passive allows you to spread small amounts of burn potency if you hit enemies who have burn already, which should theoretically be every enemy if you run a burn team. The Corrosion does this with 2 additional attack weight, and it isn't roll dependent, though you will probably deal a lot more damage with a Tails roll this time around. The downside is that it inflicts burns to all units, including your allies, and also costs Ishmael 10% of her HP. It's an absolute destructive force that you should never be without if you're running burn. Ishmael's Capote is more of a supportive E.G.O for a burn team, since Wrath is a really common Sin Affinity here. 1 Wrath damage up to the entire team is actually the desired effect on this E.G.O. The cost in this case is only a single Sloth resource, really. It also makes Ishmael's Wrath skills deal a little extra damage against low HP enemies, which is nice but not ultimately necessary. However, if you want to use 1 more of each Sin resource to use this skill, you could increase the attack weight by 2, and also give everyone 1 Wrath Fragility as well. This does also technically buff your enemies and debuff your allies, and while an additional 10% increase to Wrath skill damage doesn't seem too special, it'll make more sense as to why you'd want to use this moving on to our next E.G.O. Rodian's 4th Match Flame is a negative coin for some reason, however it makes up for it by inflicting 3 Wrath Fragility to everyone it hits, plus a decent amount of burn potency. It can also give Rodia some small healing when killing burning enemies, which is surprisingly useful, actually, since healing E.G.O tend to be pretty scarce in burn teams due to what sinners you need to bring. The corroded version is the same, except with 2 more attack weight. This seems to be a trend for these supporting E.G.O, doesn't it? It really is strange that they all seem to gain attack weight when overclocking, but with support effects this strong and strong damage as it is, there really isn't room to complain about it. Merceau's Capote continues the trend of providing offensive buffs, though this time in the form of power and only to himself. On top of the 1 Blunt and Wrath power-up, he also gains an additional +1 base power if targeted by multiple skills in the same turn, and inflicts burn to attackers when he is hit. The skill is also just hilarious, being the highest rolling E.G.O in a clash through the entire game when not factoring in effects, and then only being 3rd once effects are factored in. And despite it being single target, this E.G.O effectively inflicts burn on every enemy, and if the tacked on Tremor Burst causes a stagger, it also inflicts burn count. He doesn't even need a burn ID for this E.G.O to turn into a valuable member for a burn team. The overclocked version, once again, gains 2 attack weight and functions basically the same, but hang on, does that say on hit? Yeah, so provided this skill hits 3 enemies, this E.G.O inflicts a total of 81 burn potency across all enemies, guaranteed. In addition, this only comes at the cost of 1 more of each Sin resource, making it about as expensive as any other He E.G.O. Oh yeah, I didn't mention it, but this is the cheapest He E.G.O in the game for some reason, requiring only 5 resources total. It makes up for this by costing 5 more SP than normal, but this is incredibly spammable nonetheless, as long as you can keep up your Sloth stockpile. It's at this point that I want to point out that every E.G.O I've mentioned so far is of the Wrath affinity. Yeah, I wasn't kidding when I said Wrath is insanely common in a burn team, and Wrath Resonance is definitely where a lot of your clash strength comes from. But a nice side effect of this is enabling one of very specific non-burn E.G.O to be insanely consistent, Otis's Holiday. This is yet another E.G.O that gives Wrath damage up to allies in both its awakened and overclocked variants. In addition, this is a pretty reliable SP recovery E.G.O that burn can lean into if it has to, though the 1 Sloth and 2 Envy is actually pretty steep in terms of what you can afford to spend. The overclocked version, say it with me now, gains attack weight, but also inflicts Wrath Fragility if Wrath happens to be your highest resonance, which plays incredibly nicely with burn. Also worth mentioning is that when Otis gives a buff to an ally, there is a 20% chance to inflict 1 burn to a random enemy. Okay, so it's not that noteworthy, but look! Burn keyword! Good enough to call it a burn E.G.O for me. Other noteworthy E.G.O include Merceau's Regret, which is not only a Wrath E.G.O once again, but also incredibly easily fueled by a burn team in that it only requires Wrath and Pride to use, and also turns every Merceau into a god at clashing. Sinclair's Impending Day is yet another cheap Wrath E.G.O, and can actually heal the party if it gets a kill, which is at premium in burn teams, so it's usually quite valuable. Yisang's 4th Match Flame, while not great in the clashing department, is naturally 5 attack weight and inflicts a lot more burn potency to all enemies on hits. And lastly, Don Quixote's Lifetime Stew rolls consistently very high, as well as AoE burn count infliction, which is pretty rare. Though that passive might come back to bite you, it does make itself very spammable, only costing less resources. There's also some very non-noteworthy E.G.O that fit into the burn category, 3 of them in fact. The first is Sinclair's Lifetime Stew, which is just an RNG fest that either buffs allies while inflicting them with burn, or gives them a small amount of HP healing while dealing very low damage to enemies that it ends up hitting. That being said, the overclock version is just AoE burn count, infliction like Dawn's, though it spends so many resources to use it each time. This E.G.O also costs Gluttony, which is a nightmare for burn, which we'll get into. Actually, no, I'm talking about this now. Gluttony is the worst limiting factor of any burn team ever built, and the reason that healing is so important for them. When looking at burn IDs who can equip E.G.O that heal allies, in addition to the user, that don't require Gluttony, we're left with only 3 options. The aforementioned Sinclair's Impending Day, which can only heal on kill, Merceau's Pursuance, which not only fights for a slot with Capote, but also costs 4 Sloth to use, and Ryoshu's Red Eyes Open, which contends for a slot with 4th Match Flame, and doesn't even heal very much to begin with, relying on the skill staggering or killing enemies. There is one burn ID that has Gluttony skills in its kit. No, get that Ring Otis out of here, we're not talking about IDs yet. This lack of Gluttony, at least at the time of recording, is going to be your largest limiter when it comes to team building for burn. Well, there's one other way they can generate Gluttony, but using Rodian's Effervescent Corrosion to generate enough Gluttony to use Lantern is going to be requiring a lot more Sloth, and also turns than you'll typically have in a fight. Now that that tangent's over, let's talk about the other 2 shitters when it comes to burn E.G.O. The first is Sinclair's 9-2, which is impressive at first glance until you realize that it's anti-synergistic with itself, requiring the enemy to have a lot of burn to already be on the opponent in order to inflict power down on them, but not inflicting a lot of burn itself unless the opponent doesn't already have any, and not even enough to trigger the effect unless you corrode it, and then you're getting Lust Fragility instead of power down, which, while not useless, is a lot less useful. Plus it costs Envy, and holy shit, this is an expensive E.G.O for how little it does. Lastly, there's Faust's 9-2, which converts enemy burn into defense level down, which in theory is really nice since it's more damage. Unfortunately, it is both same turn and part of an archetype that already gets more damage up and fragility infliction than any other save for pure slash teams, making the roughly 27% increased damage not that valuable overall. And it's single target, because 4 Lust Resonance, much less 6, is not going to be your priority when 50% of all of your usable E.G.O is Wrath, in addition to most of your defense skills being either Wrath or Pride. Oh, and it costs 3 fucking Gluttony! So, as you can see, Burn has access to some of the most powerful E.G.O in the game to fit its archetype. It also, unfortunately, has a few E.G.O which are easily identifiable as garbage, though they're easy to avoid. They are very E.G.O reliant, but thankfully, all of their most important E.G.O is fairly easy to fuel. Moving on to our team core, once again consisting of 4 identities, we'll start out with... Actually, no, I need to address something first. 2 of the identities I'm going to be talking about here are locked behind Walpurgisnacht. The issue with Walpurgisnacht is that you can only obtain those IDs during the event, which only takes place over a period of 2 weeks every 3 months or so. As of the recording of this video, I do not know when the next one will be, but I'll try to talk about valuable substitutions for each of these when they come up. So to start off, we have Liu Ishmael, commonly known as the first truly good burn ID added to the game. The Liu are the poster child for the burn archetype, and every single one of them has at least 1 Wrath and 1 Lust skill. Usually the Wrath skill will be skill 2, which in this case is Frontal Assault, which is just a great skill. A 4-16 by default that can become a 4-22 if the enemy has 12 burn potency, while also inflicting burn count if the enemy has enough potency is just everything a unit like this could ask for. One thing you'll notice about burn IDs is that they tend to get a lot more powerful when facing burning opponents, and one of the reasons they tend to underwhelm outside of a burn team is exactly because of this. Red Kick, for example, is nothing special for a skill 1, especially nowadays, but it becomes a whole lot more reliable once burn gets going, an impossibility without building around it. Innergate Elbow Strike is the only instance of Envy in the entire Liu association, and instead of gaining power against enemies with burn, it gains a lot of damage. Plus, the last coin gives plus coin boost if it staggers or kills. Plus coin boost on an ID with this many coins is just amazing. though it is a bit inconsistent to actually get the effect, but you'll find it's more common than you'd expect as well. The best burn IDs usually have respectable defenses in addition to a counter for a defense skill. In this case, it will also inflict burn count on hit, which is just an added bonus really. Ishmael does also have a passive which increases her damage against burning enemies. 3 Wrath Resonance isn't at all hard to achieve, and this 30% damage bonus can apply to every one of her skills. She's effectively the rushdown damage dealer of the team. If Ishmael is the one who capitalizes on burn the most, Liu Rodian is the one responsible for keeping the fire lit. The key to this is Fiery Knife Hand Combust, a skill which always inflicts 2 to 3 burn count and has the same power range as Frontal Assault. It can also spread a small amount of potency if the target is already overloaded with count. Her counter is identical to Ishmael's, except that it inflicts potency instead of count for some reason. Her skill 1, Flaming Fists, is a slightly stronger version of Red Kick due to the base power and coin power being inverted, but being exactly the same otherwise, and is a good pride generator for the team. The only skill that functions in a way that is unique from Ishmael is Pinpoint Blitz, which not only can gain coin power, but has a final hit which consumes enemy burn count to deal wrath damage equal to their burn potency, up to 30 damage. While the 30 damage cap is completely arbitrary, seriously, this is the most disappointing set of parentheses in the entire game, it's always helpful to deal just a bit of extra damage on a skill that already hits pretty hard, even if it doesn't get improved by Wrath Fragility or Wrath Damage up. So what makes her different from Ishmael? Well, not much, which is why she works so well inside of a burn composition to begin with. Her passive even has the exact same first line, except it doesn't restrict you to just blunt damage. However, if all of your enemies have a good amount of burn, triggering Wrath Absolute Resonance will also give Wrath damage up to allies in deployment order. What's more, if those allies are from the Liu, they also gain 1 attack power up. I mean, did you think we were done talking about Wrath damage increases just because we stopped talking about E.G.O? That would be ridiculous. Though, that being said, this is the last effect like this for this team, finally. It's also worth mentioning that every single member of the Liu Association both resists Blunt and is weak to Pierce, with the exception being Rhodia, who resists Pierce and is weak to Slash. Why they made Rhodia the only ID to break this rule is beyond me, but it gives her an important defensive role to play in the team as a result. Next up is Dawn Office Fixer Sinclair, who is the first ID locked behind Walpurgisnacht. His playstyle revolves around a status effect he gains once he reaches 45 SP, Volatile Passion. In addition to costing 20 SP when you gain the effect, Volatile Passion costs 5 SP at the end of every turn, increasing by 5 for every turn that the effect has been in place. In return, he inflicts 1 burn potency with every hit, and gains 1 final power against burning enemies, plus activating a lot of additional effects on each of his skills. As long as you stay above 0 SP, you retain Volatile Passion, which becomes harder as time goes on due to its increasing costs. This Sinclair naturally gains more SP than usual when winning a clash to compensate for having to play around this effect. His actual passive makes him inflict more burn potency and count with his skills, and also just gives him coin power while he has Volatile Passion, which he actually relies on pretty heavily. But yeah, even without looking at his skills, it should be clear as to why Dawn Sinclair is so valuable in burn teams. His skill 1 is fairly weak normally, but rerolls on heads hit when in a volatile E.G.O state. It also is going to be your only real source of gloom in most burn teams, due to it being surprisingly rare like Gluttony is. But you don't lose out on nearly as much for having a small amount of gloom as you do with Gluttony. Sunset Blade is also like Fiery Knife Hand Combust in that it inflicts 3 burn count, but it also just becomes AoE while you have Volatile Passion, giving it a maximum of +2 attack weight. This feels familiar for some reason. Anyways, this skill is also important because it's Envy, being the only other Envy skill in the team core at least. Stigmatize is a really reliable skill for clashing and even gives more SP on winning a clash, plus it inflicts a surprisingly high amount of burn potency. More importantly, however, is that it becomes Blazing Strike while you have Volatile Passion, which truly makes Sinclair live up to his reputation as the
Hydrogen Baby.
It rolls absurdly high, gains coin power based on how much burn is on every enemy, gains increased damage based on your Wrath Resonance, even more damage if Wrath is your highest absolute resonance, even more damage if the target has a lot of burn. Yeah, this skill can deal a lot of damage under the right circumstances, and those circumstances aren't exactly hard to reach in a burn team. His defense skill is also the strongest guard in the game, though only with Volatile Passion, and due to his frailty, it's usually better to just try to win a clash instead. Though it is Lust, so keep that in mind when we talk about support passives. Missed Walpurgis Nacht? Well, thankfully, Sinclair is one of the only Sinners with more than a single burn ID, so you have another option in The One Who Shall Grip Sinclair. He's the only good negative coin ID in the game, having insanely high damage with half of his skills and very reliable clashes. While he does inflict a good amount of burn potency, he's usually a lot more reliable as a straight damage dealer due to how high his skills roll and how good they are with their damage conditionals. He still has most of the same rolls as Dawn Office Sinclair, except that his second skill is Lust instead of Envy, which is useful in its own right, but it's going to push your Envy generation very thin. Plus, his tendency to corrode means that equipping a E.G.O is maybe a bit risky, unless you're willing to use that guard of his to moderate yourself. He's definitely still a fantastic unit, just a bit less consistent in the burn department specifically. Lastly, we have Magic Bullet Otis. She actually inflicts very little burn overall in her kit, but that's because she does something else that's just as important. She inflicts Dark Flame. Dark Flame reduces enemy defense level by its value, always a welcome effect, but also it inflicts pride damage equal to its value times the enemy's burn potency at the end of the turn. At its maximum potential, which will almost never happen for the record, this can deal 1,386 damage against a target who is weak to pride. In practice, it's not going to do nearly that much until very late into the fight. In addition to having the most specifically worded passive to increase damage dealt by 20%, she also has one of the most reliable skill 1s in the game in the form of Ignition. Outside of a burn team, the skill is very underwhelming. In a burn team, it can easily roll 18 in a clash due to having matching power to Flaming Fists, but with an additional maximum coin power increase. Her second skill is more of the same, being an average skill that becomes very powerful in a burn setup. It also increments her second gimmick known as Magic Bullet. This is really just a tally that her third skill looks at. Magic Bullet Fire is yet another insanely high rolling burn skill. It once again gains attack weight, though this time based on your Magic Bullet count, and really is just a way to deal high AoE damage and inflict a bunch of Dark Flame. It also reveals Otis's third gimmick. She generates Pride. In fact, she's the reason that Pride is not an issue in a burn team. This skill is also funny in that it counts as spending your last ammo if used at 7 Magic Bullet, which makes it deal a lot of damage if you use LCCB Ryoshu's support passive. Though realistically, this is almost never going to happen. Fights just aren't long enough to get that much Magic Bullet. Lastly, her defense skill is the easiest way to gain Magic Bullet, though usually it isn't worth using over an attack. Though, Magic Bullet Otis is locked behind Walpurgis Nacht, so your other option is usually going to be Ring Pointillist Student Otis. This is not a burn ID. Actually, she can inflict burn potency through both her passive and her skill 3. Yeah, that isn't very convincing. Actually, she's really solid here, having both a Lust and Wrath skill, in addition to having the incredibly rare Gluttony skill that also gives allies haste to activate Holiday's passive. Her skill 1 is never going to hit its full potential. This is not a bleed team. It is only useful due to being another Lust skill. Sanguine Painting, on the contrary, is insanely good in any team focusing on debuffs. Its reusable second coin allows it to deal massive damage, and with it being a Wrath skill, and with how much Wrath damage up in Wrath Fragility, which counts as a debuff by the way, this team can provide, this skill deals incredible amounts of damage. The big downside to using her over Magic Bullet Otis is that you lose your consistent Pride generation, which really is too important to give up. You'll have to substitute a different burn ID for at least one other to generate a good amount of Pride. And this is where I'd talk in depth about all of the other Leo IDs if they didn't all suck. Okay, that's not entirely fair to Ryoshu. It's fair to the other 3. You see, the Blowjob brothers over here were released very early into the game's development, and as a result, are absolutely abysmal clashers. They all work fine in the Mirror Dungeon, but outside of it, they are never really reliable, even in a burn team. Merceau himself focuses on inflicting a lot of burn by spreading it with his other higher skills, though that doesn't make up for his skill 2, only rolling an 11 at max. His only other notable upside is having a Sloth skill, which does not save him, unfortunately. Hong Lu inflicts a good amount of burn count while on high SP, but his skills don't even get that high rolling even if their conditionals are fulfilled. His best use in one of these teams is for his support passive, which allows you to maintain burn count more easily. Gregor inflicts quite a lot of burn potency and has a lot of coins, but his coin power is just way too low to be consistently good, even with his +5 offense level on all skills. He does have Sloth, but there are better options. Ryoshu is the only one of them that can actually clash well once burn gets going. Oddly though, she doesn't actually inflict a lot of burn herself, with not a single skill that inflicts count, and with each skill inflicting 2.6 potency on average for some reason. She has respectable damage though, and being the only true burn ID with Gluttony makes it so that I can actually recommend her for the team, just not as part of the core. She's best to bring if you actually want to use Sinclair's Lantern for team healing. So yeah, it's time to get a little creative. Wait, why is the core team layout coming back? Little brother Merceau? Why are you here? My name isn't in that book of vengeance of yours, right? Oh, you want me to go over your abilities? But you're not a burn... Okay, fine. I'll do it. All jokes aside, yeah, Middle Merceau is one of the strongest IDs for any burn setup. You're not going to be fulfilling any of his conditionals, but he has other important factors for the team. Perhaps his single most important role is just having a Sloth skill 1. No, really, Capote makes up for any burn application that he loses for not being a burn ID, and just the ability to generate Sloth this often puts him well above a lot of other competing IDs. Chains of Loyalty being able to generate Envy is also super helpful, especially for those who don't have Dawn Office Sinclair from Valpurgisnacht. Merceau's middling speed also makes it all the more likely to give bonuses to both Sunset Blade and Innergate Elbow Strike with its combat start effect. He also has readily available Envy generation thanks to his counter, and it's one of the best counters in the game too. Recording is about as good as Liu Merceau's skill 3 is in most cases, though if he manages to hit an enemy with Vengeance Mark from his passive, he can inflict plus coin drop to them, which is incredibly helpful for a team that is already this reliant on improving their clash ability. Unlike Perfected Death Fist, this skill happens to be blunt in addition to Wrath, meaning Capote will actually increase its power by 2 instead of just 1. His overall rolls are also just better than Leo Merceau's, and Regret will make up for his slightly lower overall power. I can't say the same for Liu, unfortunately. Alright, with that out of the way, other competent IDs include any strong ID that either has Sloth or Envy somewhere in their kit, while also having a Wrath skill somewhere. The first of these to recommend is Edgar Family Chief Butler Ryoshu, who has neither Sloth nor Envy, but for those of you missing Magic Bullet Otis, she generates a good amount of Pride while also having very high damage potential. She also synergizes with her own Blind Obsession to maintain her poise to improve her damage more consistently. Want a different Ryoshu? Well, RB Sous Chef Ryoshu has a Wrath skill 1, making Wrath Resonance a lot easier. She also has a very powerful Envy skill 2 and can provide healing to allies when killing an enemy. Her biggest downside is not having any Pride, but she's probably worth it if you actually have Magic Bullet Otis, but maybe are missing Dawn Office Sinclair. Molar Fixer Otis is a decent enough substitute if you don't have either of the others mentioned. She doesn't inflict any burn, not that Magic Bullet Otis does a lot either, but she does generate Sloth a decent amount and has very good damage in clashing overall. Her biggest downside is not wanting to use her Wrath skill, but it is there for resonance anyways. Regret Faust is also a very reliable choice for this team, should you want to focus more on Sloth generation. She has a decent amount of AoE skills, inflicts a lot of different debuffs for those of you who have to bring Ring Otis, generates a good amount of Pride, and her skill 3 is just insane. Plus, while it'll be tougher to fuel, you get access to Fluid Sac, which is just insane, or you could be crazy like me and bring Telepole for the extra damage since it's fairly cheap to fuel in a burn team. Or if you'd prefer more consistent Fluid Sacs as well as debuffs to help your clashing, you could, yes really, use W Corp Faust. Her ability to inflict bind and attack power down, fantastic Envy generation, and overall tankiness make her at least a decent option if you really want Fluid Sac for its healing properties. She's not even going to come close to the damage of the other IDs I've mentioned so far, though. Lastly, the only ID I will recommend who doesn't have a Wrath skill is Ring Yi Sang. He can inflict burn, and is good for the same reasons that Ring Otis is in this team minus the Wrath skill too. He can also generate Sloth, which isn't as high amounts here, but is important nonetheless. Okay, so this is getting added later, but I forgot to talk about Pequod Ishmael. She does have burn, but the majority of her burn infliction can only be done on the turn after she gets a kill. And while she does have good Sin Affinities, this ID is so complicated that talking about it in depth would bog this video down. Liu Ishmael is better for burn, and that's all you really need to know. Support passives are pretty important for the burn archetype. I already mentioned Liu Honglu's in that he inflicts more burn count for a team member, but there are a few others. She Heathcliff is more free damage on activating Wrath Resonance. Yeah, I lied about there being more damage up in Wrath Resonance. What are you gonna do about it? Chef Gregor gives passive HP recovery to the team, which is arguably more useful than damage in this case. There are several Gregs that do this, but Lust is the easiest resource to get out of the ones that you would require. Ring Yi Sang also helps to keep Dawn Sinclair at high sanity, as does N-Corp Faust, who can also give Fanatic to N-Corp Sinclair to buff his damage output by a bit. Lust Resonance, while not as common as Wrath Resonance, is still fairly common in this setup. Your team order actually does matter in a burn setup. Liu Rodia's support passive will activate in deployment order, meaning you get the maximum possible effect if you have your Liu association IDs further to the front of the team. There are several E.G.O that, in addition to being powerful skills overall, should be used as soon as possible into a fight so that their passive has the most time to be effective. The primary candidates for this are Ishmael's Ardor Blossom Star for more burn potency infliction, Ryoshu's 4th Match Flame for the occasional massive boost in power, and Merceau's Regret to make his rolls a lot more reliable. Try to have a Wrath Resonance of at least 3 on every turn once you have burn inflicted to all of your targets in order to have the highest possible damage output for your Liu units. Beyond that, just,
Burn them.
Burn being typeless damage means that no matter what you're facing, the more burn you inflict, the faster you'll be done with the fight. Well, this means that Magic Bullet Otis and the passive from Ryoshu's 4th Match Flame will never really get to shine. Speed is the name of the game anyways, and this is a very offense-forward archetype to begin with. Burn in the Mirror Dungeon is pretty simple. Burn E.G.O gifts can be neatly divided into gifts that help inflict more burn, and gifts that do something when inflicting burn or while the enemy has it. And immediately, you can disregard every gift found in the category of increased burn infliction, because 2 of the starting gifts are Helterfly's Dream and Fiery Down, the 2 best gifts for quickly inflicting a lot of burn. You're going to be picking these every burn run, not because Pain of Stifled Rage is bad, but because Acceleration of Burn Infliction already turns this archetype into one of the fastest in the Mirror Dungeon. Pinpoint Logic Circuit, Melted Paraffin, and even Hot and Juicy Drumstick, which is otherwise fantastic, are just not useful in any situation exclusively because you can start with Fiery Down and Helterfly's Dream. You may be questioning as to why I don't say the same about Ashes to Ashes and Dust to Dust. Truthfully, they are also pretty useless on their own in a burn team. However, they combine into Soothe the Dead, a gift that gives power to your skills that inflict burn while also allowing you to inflict more burn. This is a really important gift to get since most of your skills are just shy of being completely reliable. While talking about the best burn gifts, Glimpse of Flames just by itself can reduce most enemies to their base particles. The fact that the damage is multiplicative is just insane, and it can result in burn outpacing even bleed teams in terms of overall damage output, especially against bosses where all of your burn infliction is focused onto a single enemy. Charred Disc is weird in that its primary effect is pretty useless, however it does decrease the offense level of enemies who have burn by 4, which can help a decent amount in clashing. Pain of Stifled Rage is similar, in that it makes your lead units gain haste and offense level up when they inflict burn to enemies. Overall, while not a priority to find, it's a pretty useful gift to have. Polarization and Ardent Flower both increase your damage when inflicting burn to enemies, it's just that Ardent Flower is about 6 times as potent as Polarization. The only difference is that Polarization can hit your entire party, whereas Ardent Flower can only affect half of them at most. Fragment of Hellfire is decent in that it increases your E.G.O power, but since burn E.G.O already rolls insanely high, it's actually a lot less useful than you'd think. Situations where your E.G.O would only win if it had the small power boost are practically non-existent, and it really only serves to up their damage a little bit. And lastly, Burning Intellect is, well, bad. And that's pretty much everything there is to say about the burn archetype. Since I talked about literally half of all Walpurgis Nacht IDs and also one of its E.G.O, I'm going to include the 4 units that were mentioned in my rental IDs so that people can borrow them if they need to. And hey, if you liked the video, you should subscribe, because I'm running out of chicken. I'm running out of